Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, standing trial. Senators in Brazil voted to impeach President Dilma Rousseff, suspending the leader for at least 6 months in the nation's first impeachment in 24 years. And revisiting history, later this month, Barack Obama, the U.S. president, will become the president to visit Hiroshima, sparking renewed debate over Washington's use of nuclear weapons in World War II. And we begin tonight's show in Brazil, where the country's president, Dilma Rousseff, has been forced to step aside for now. After a series of hurdles, Rousseff is to face trial after Brazil's Senate voted to impeach and suspend her. The trial may last up to 180 days, which would mean Rousseff would be suspended during the time of the Olympic Games in Rio de Janeiro, which starts on August the 5th.
A historic vote. After months of speculation, mudslinging and debate, the embattled Brazilian president's fate is now in the hands of her country's Senate, which will likely end 13 years of government by her left-leaning party amid a spate of crises besetting Latin America's largest nation.
It was the people who did this, who first took the streets all over Brazil to say no more disdain for the truth, for ethics, for a right management of public administration.
Rousseff is accused of using illegal accounting maneuvers to hide budget discrepancies ahead of her re-election in 2014, charges which she has denied. In the Senate, arguments in favor of impeachment have mainly been economic. Many blamed President Rousseff for Brazil's worst economic downturn in decades. A sprawling corruption scandal centered on the state-run Petrobras oil company has also soured the national mood, even as the country gears up to host South America's first Olympic Games in August.
12 years since the ruling party brought us hope, but now we are seeing that everything worsening.
Prices went up a lot. When I just started working, my salary could buy a lot of things. Now I can't afford that many things with the same amount of money.
Some say that the showdown is a major reason behind the drive to unseat Rousseff.
When relevant indices started to fall, the government can no longer balance workers, financial capital and the enterprises, which as a result make it hard for the government to maintain political alliances. The political crisis is directly linked to the difficulty that the government has to deal with different social classes.
The trial could last up to 180 days. If 2/3 of the Senate find Rousseff guilty when the trial ends, she will be removed from office permanently. But until then, and perhaps even after, the future of Brazil remains uncertain.
Before the discussion, let's go to the live signals.
Of the Senate, I want one more time clarify the facts and denounce the risks to the country of an impeachment that is not truthful. It's a coup. Since I was elected, part of the opposition has not accepted and has requested the recount of the votes, tried to annul the elections, and after that started to conspire openly for my impeachment. They turned the country upside down. It blocked the chances we had to prosper with the objective of gaining by force what they didn't gain in the election. My government has been the objective of sabotage. The objective is clear: impeding my government to go forward, and so create a climate that would be open to the coup. When a Brazilian or when a president is impeached for a crime that has not committed, the name that we have for this in the democracy, it's not an impeachment, it's a coup. I have not committed any responsibility crimes. There is no reason for the impeachment process. I don't have accounts abroad. I never received any money illegally. I am not part of the corruption scheme. This process is a fragile process. It's not consistent, it's unjust, and started against a person that's honest and not guilty. It's a brutality that could be committed against any citizen, to punish somebody for a crime that he did not or she did not commit. There is no injustice more deeply than condemn an innocent person. Injustice is impossible to repair. That I am subjected to. I will never accept it. I never accepted it in the past, any type of blackmailing. I have made mistakes, but I have not made any crimes. I am being judged unjustly because I have followed the law to the letter. The acts that I have followed are legal acts, correct, necessary to govern the country, identical to previous presidents. It was not a crime at their time, and it's not a crime now. They have accused me to have followed 6 laws of supplementary credit. And doing this, I have committed a crime against budgetary laws. That is false, because these decrees followed authorizations that were prescribed by the law. It's a regular action of management. They say I'm delayed in paying the Safra plan. That's not true. The law does not demand my participation in the execution of this plan. The people that accuse me cannot even tell us what are the acts that I have infringed. Nothing is left to be paid. There are no debts. Never in a democracy the legitimate mandate of a president should be interrupted because of acts that are legitimate in a budgetary situation. Brazil cannot be the first one to do that. I would like to direct me now to the population and say that the coup has as a goal not only to suspend my mandate. President was elected by millions of Brazilians, direct election and a just election. Suspending me and my government, what they want is to forbid the execution of the program that was chosen by the majority of the 54 million Brazilian votes. The coup threatens democracy, but also the conquers that we have obtained in the last decades. During all this time, I have been also faithful to democracy. It's my obligation. My government has not made any repressive acts against any social movements, against other movements that are asking, or manifestations that have been taking place, against any political parties. The risk right now is to be led by a government that was not elected. It was not elected by the direct vote of the Brazilian population. A government that is not legitimate to suggest and implement solutions for the challenges that Brazil...
That is President Rousseff of Brazil talking about what she described as a coup, which is she has been suspended for 180 days from her presidency. She's been describing during the press conference giving just now that she is innocent, that repeatedly, and also she said there's no reason for impeachment process. She said that is not a democracy that people are witnessing right now. In the democracy, according to her, the president's work should not be interrupted on unfounded evidence of quote-unquote crime. She also said her actions being described as guilty, in fact, have been identical to all the previous presidents. If in their cases it is not crime, in her case, it shouldn't be. She said, but is that true? Let me go to some of the panelists with us. We are having Mr. Yang Zhimin from the Institute of Latin American Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome, sir. In Rio de Janeiro, in Brazil, we are having Mr. Charles Tang, President of Brazil-China Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And in Washington, D.C., from the U.S., we are joined by Mr. Eric Farnsworth, who is Vice President of the American Society and Council of the Americas. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. First of all, Mr. Tang, since you are based in Brazil, how would you respond and react to the statement just made by President Rousseff, suspended for 180 days?
Well, as you know, Brazil right now is a very, very country. Overwhelming majority of the lower house and the Senate voted to start impeachment proceedings against President Dilma. And as such, she must be retired for 180 days, stand aside for 180 days. And so there is a tremendous debate, of course, where the people who insist on her impeachment said it's not only because of the deficit spending and the fiscal deficit, but it's also because it's causing a tremendous economic hardship on the Brazilian people.
All right.
And as you know, Brazilian recession is huge.
Right. But Mr. Farnsworth, should a president be impeached on the grounds of poor economic policy?
Well, this is clearly a constitutional process in Brazil, and it appears as if both the House and the Senate are pursuing it appropriately. The question is, has she done anything illegal? Has she committed any crimes? It's one thing to be a bad manager of an economy. It's one thing to be a bad politician. It's another to have done things that are illegal or against the law. And I think that's what the Senate has 180 days now to try to decide. I think it's probably pretty clear, however, that they will decide against her, because in order for a conviction, you need 2/3 of the senators to vote in favor of a conviction, in other words, 54 votes. Well, yesterday, or earlier this morning, I should say, they had 55 votes. So if all of those senators continue to vote in the same way, then she will presumably be convicted, and then Vice President Temer, who becomes president today, will finish out the rest of her mandate.
But what would this mean? Is this going to be, as she described, as a coup? If she steps aside and the vice president step into the office, will there be strong political oppositions from both sides holding different ideas in the country? What would that mean for Brazil politically, given the fact that it is already quite a chaotic situation? Mr. Tang.
Well, you know, the political instability, of course, has a great impact on the economic stability of the country. However, the new ministers announced by future President Temer are very proven. He's made some wise choices in selecting very capable people. Just to name a few, Enrique Meirelles, former president of the Bank of Boston in Boston, former president of the Central Bank of Brazil under Lula. He's really not a, you know, isn't for one party against another. He's just a very capable executive. José Serra, who was the one who launched the generics medicine in Brazil when he was the Minister of Health, and you know, studied at Cornell University.
But what are you suggesting here, sir?
All people who have. I'm suggesting that President Temer is trying to recover the confidence of the Brazilian people and trying to lift the Brazilian economy from the, recession, hopeless recession that it has been facing. He's trying to give new hope.
So from your perspective, is this a coup, or as she described, of course she's using quite some political extreme words, but is this a coup to you or not?
Well, I mean, to her it is, and to the party it is. To the Supreme Court of Brazil and to the majority of Congress and Senate, it's not.
All right, Mr.
So,
Farnsworth.
I mean, I don't...
Yeah, let me go to another guest. Mr. Farnsworth, what do you make of her description? Of course, she, from her own perspective, have a way of looking at it. But having said that, though, what does that mean for Brazil politically speaking? 24 years ago, there was a similar impeachment, but she didn't commit crimes, at least not about corruption. She has been, in a way, being described as guilty about. And in fact, many of those who try to impeach her are as guilty, if not more, about the corruption as her.
Well, I think anytime you call something in Latin America a coup, you really amplify and polarize the situation. I think there's no doubt about it. And it's not just in the context of Latin America, but also in the context of Brazil. Remember, Brazil faced a military dictatorship before democracy was restored, even before the impeachment that you're referring to of former President Collor. So this is like adding fuel to the fire. It's a signal to her supporters in the Workers' Party and others who might be supporting her that indeed she's going to fight these charges and fight them aggressively, that she's not just going to go away and say, okay, well, they made their vote and I'm going to retire. So I think to the extent she continues to make this an issue, call it a coup, and try to continue pursuing that line of argument, that will continue to polarize the country and frankly make the restoration of economic confidence that your other guest was referring to that much more difficult, because it's going to require political consensus to push through the economic reforms that are plainly required to get Brazil out of the very deep recession it's been in now for the last 2 years.
All right. Just to recap for our audience who are watching our program right now, just now during the process of program we have been receiving signals in which the President of Brazil, who has been impeached, or at least in the process of being impeached, President Rousseff was talking about herself as being not guilty, and the overall impeachment trial and the process of impeaching her is what she described as a coup, and she said it is unjust. Of course, those are her words, but now let me come back to you, Mr. Yang, here in Beijing. Who are dividing the country? Of course, at this critical moment, people want to throw those words to those that are their political opposition, but who are dividing the country? Is the president dividing the country? Or are those who try to impeach her dividing the country? Of course, they all say it's the other side. But then when a country is divided in terms of their ideas as to whether presidents should go or remain, will that country be a stable one? What is the next one who is likely to be in the office, at least for now, can do?
Yeah. I think it's very difficult answer, but from my view, I think it's cannot due to the President Dilma Rousseff herself and also the operation. I think the difficult time or the how to say the bad economic performance and the political struggle and also the social unrest, all the factors have been combined together to make the very difficult time for Brazil. I think it's not the wrongdoing of the Dilma Rousseff herself. If the next one, maybe the Temer, come into power as the acting president of Brazil, I think it's also difficult for him. Maybe the next president is not him, maybe the next one. But I think no matter who is the next president of Brazil, it's difficult for them because the root cause of Brazil is not the political struggle. It's because of the how to foster the construction reform in the country.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Therefore, let me go to you, Mr. Farnsworth. Some have been arguing for her leave the current position? One, of course, there's a legal impeachment process going on. She has to, go with that. But at the same time, others say, well, please go, because if you don't go, the country will be divided. But if she does leave, the country will remain divided. That is the question. So, Mr. Farnsworth, what do you say can be the choices? President Rousseff, she is still the president because she's not being impeached legally. She's only in the process being suspended. So what can she do?
Well, I think that's exactly right. I mean, there is a question here about when will this situation be surpassed? And I think that the real answer is that many Brazilians are already looking ahead to the next presidential elections in 2018, no matter if President Rousseff is permanently removed from the presidency or not. The irony here, and I think you're alluding to it, is very interesting. The irony here is she was reelected as president only a year and a half ago at the end of 2014, and she was inaugurated for her second term in early 2015. So they just went through an election. She was just reelected, and now her popularity is down at around 10%, if you can believe the polls in Brazil. And so she has clearly lost public support. I don't know that that people are going to want her necessarily to come back into the office, into her office. I think that, truthfully speaking, they're more concerned about their daily lives. I mean, the difficulty of getting to work in terms of public transportation, the cost of living that's going up and the standard of living that's going down, some of the unemployment that's increasing, some of the inflation that is now beginning to be an issue.
It is very clear, Mr. Farnsworth, all the symptoms you have just described to all of us and also Brazilian citizens. But the question is, Mr. Tang, before we go, very briefly from you, even for the next leader, whoever it is, things are not likely to change in half a year or in 1 year or two. So can Brazil continue to impeach whoever is in the office? And what is going to be the alternative policies?
Well, like I said, President Temer is putting out some clever policies, has made some wise choices for ministers. And I believe that according to the stock market and also the exchange rate, the people have new hope. Now, according to the latest poll, however, former President Lula has the largest intention of vote and also the largest rejection factor. And the second will come Marina for the 2018 elections. And third and last is the candidate of the opposition, Aécio Neves. So it's very early to say what will happen. It will depend on how well Temer is able to govern Brazil. And he has overwhelming support both in the lower house and in the Senate.
All right.
All the people, the overwhelming people who voted to oust President Dilma and have him replace her will probably support his policies.
We'll see what's going to happen. But one thing is for sure, her presidency also during the time of the Rio Olympic Games. So what would that mean for the international community when celebrating this wonderful sports event? Every 4 years only it happens once. But for now, thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Charles Tang, Eric Farnsworth, and Yang Zhimin. Really appreciate it, gentlemen, for being with us on this critical moment. Chaos of politics in Brazil. Stay with us here on World Insight. We got our final segment coming right up. Revisiting World War II, Obama will become the first U.S. president to visit Hiroshima in Japan later this month, sparking renewed debate over the historic atomic bombing. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight on CCTV News. U.S. President Barack Obama has made plans to visit Hiroshima when he attends the G7 summit in Japan later this month. He will become the first serving U.S. president to visit the site of America's first nuclear attack. Obama hopes to underscore his efforts to curb nuclear proliferation, and the White House has stressed that the visit should not be interpreted as an apology. Let's have a look.
Turning heads. Washington announced this week that President Barack Obama will visit Hiroshima with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe on May 27, the first visit by a sitting U.S. president to the site.
We warmly welcome President Obama's decision to visit Hiroshima. Many people were sadly victims of the atomic bomb that was dropped on the city more than 70 years ago. I hope that this visit will be an opportunity for Japan and the U.S. to remember all these victims together.
However, the White House went out of its way to stress that Mr. Obama has no plans to apologize for the world's first nuclear bombing.
The president intends to visit to send a much more forward-looking signal about his ambition for realizing the goal of a planet without nuclear weapons.
The Hiroshima bombing on August 6, 1945, killed around 140,000 people. Another atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki 3 days later. This move was credited with ending World War II. However, a scarred generation of Japanese people have a different opinion on Obama's coming visit.
We are not expecting a verbal apology, but I would like for him to firmly clarify his intentions regarding eliminating nuclear weapons. To me, that would be a true form of an apology.
If he's to visit, of course everyone wants to hear an apology.
Obama's historic visit can be interpreted many ways, but most can agree that the destruction caused by atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki 71 years ago points to the need for a nuclear-free world.
For more on President Obama's possible visit to Hiroshima, we are joined here in the Beijing studio, Mr. Jia Daojun, professor from the School of International Studies at Peking University. Welcome, Professor, to our program. Meanwhile, joining us here in Tokyo, in Japan, we are having Mr. Ken Jimbo, associate professor from the Faculty of Policy Management in Keio University. Welcome, Mr. Jimbo. And in Washington, D.C., we are having Peter Kuznick, who is a professor of history and also director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at the American University. Welcome, Professor Kuznick, as well. Gentlemen, how to interpret the significance and behind-the-scenes meanings of President Obama's decision to go to Hiroshima, official visit, in fact, this time, is an interesting question, isn't it? Mr. Jimbo, your interpretation here, is it an apology or not?
Well, President Obama's main agenda is to realize the world free of nuclear weapons, and he made a historic speech in Prague back in 2009. And he actually paid an effort to decrease the strategic nuclear weapons with Russia. He made a deal with Iran for delaying the process of the nuclearization at least for 10 to 20 years. And then I think his main agenda is to finalize its own goal to, aspire for the nuclear weapons by visiting very symbolical historic city of Hiroshima. So I think it is based on his main agenda to realize his own agendas.
But the question is, Mr. Jimbo, how is it likely to be interpreted in Japan at the time when the war was at a critical stage? Of course, Japan eventually lost, as they say, starting from the Hiroshima crisis, of course. So how is it likely to be interpreted to the Japanese?
Obviously, for Japanese people and the government, Hiroshima has a special meaning. Obviously, we suffered, the mass humanitarian casualty because of the dropping of the atomic bomb. It has been symbolized as the peace studies in Japan and our symbolical gesture for the non-nuclear world. But at the same time, the Japanese government or the media did not demand the official apology of President Obama, but rather we welcome his visit because of his demonstration of the compassionate towards this historical site in Hiroshima.
All right. Professor Kuznick, should the U.S. apologize at all? Of course, the White House said not at all, and we are not apologizing also for the crisis, or rather the sacrifices made by the American soldiers during World War II to liberate different parts of the world, including to fight against the Japanese aggression during the Second World War. What do you make of the behind-the-scenes reasons, Professor?
Well, I think it would be a good idea. I think the United States should apologize for the atomic bombs. The atomic bombs were neither militarily necessary and certainly not morally justifiable. The Japanese were already pressing for peace at that point. Truman understood that better than almost anybody. He says that when he got Stalin's acknowledgement that the Russians were going to come into the Pacific War at Potsdam, Truman writes in his diary, Stalin will be in the Jap war by August 15th. Finny Japs when that occurs. He writes home to his wife the next day, the Russians are coming in, we'll end the war a year sooner now. Think of all the boys who won't be killed. He describes the intercepted July 18th telegram as a telegram from the Jap emperor asking for peace. Truman knew full well that the Soviet invasion was going to end the war, that the Japanese would know that it was all hope was
so
lost.
your
at
point
that
is,
point.
Professor?
My point is that the atomic bombings were a horrific lesson to the world of what the United States was willing to do to send a message about American post-war hegemony. That's a shameful incident, and that Obama should certainly apologize for what happened. But that's not the most important thing. I agree with the idea that actions speak louder than words, and what Obama really needs to do is use this as an occasion to push an anti-nuclear agenda, to follow through on his pledge in Prague to call for nuclear abolition. Unfortunately, Obama has gone the opposite direction.
All right, Professor John. We've got a critic from the U.S. Talking about President Obama. But anyway, let me come back to you. One of the things that Professor Kaznik said is describing the situation then for the U.S. to use the atomic bomb to Japan's Hiroshima is, here I quote, military necessary, yet ethically not justifiable, morally not justifiable. But so the question is how to see history and how to see the decision-making process or the decision being made at a critical juncture of history.
Well, obviously the United States is the only country that's ever used the nuclear weapon as a weapon for many other countries, in spite of all the talk of how horrible other nations have been or may be in the future. Thus far, we have only one case. That's the United States using the weapon on Japan, on Hiroshima. I would say that the visit is an action, and the words are left for both the Japanese polity, the Japanese society, and the American polity to take whatever is comfortable with. It's a different way of trying to demonstrate closure about history between Japan and the United States. But what worries me, frankly speaking, is that many in Japan may turn this around and say, look, if the United States and Japan can have a closure of history without an apology, without differentiating the victimizer and the victim, what point? Why you folks in China, in Korea,
or in South Korea,
or in
North Korea,
or even elsewhere in Asia cannot do the same? I would think that would be the ramifications throughout the region.
Professor Kaznik, have you ever thought about that possibility?
Yes, of course. But I think it's important. History is very important. And the United States, at the core of America's idea of American exceptionalism, is the notion that World War II is a good war, which I think it was for the United States, but also that the atomic bombs ended the war, which is not true, and that the atomic bombs were justifiable. If Americans grappled with the notion that we dropped the atomic bombs in large part to send a warning to the Soviet Union, they were dropped on Japan, and Japan was victimized by them, but the real point of it was sending a message to the Soviet Union that the United States would do almost anything in order to make sure that the Soviets didn't interfere with post-war, with America's post-war hegemonic plans in Asia and in Europe.
We got your point. Let Professor Zhao respond briefly also.
Let's hope the United States would really learn a lesson from its own history of such cold-blooded calculation of saying, I'm going to drop a bomb on one country to send a message to another country, no matter where that is. And that's very, should I say, skillful explanation in the time of today's. I'm not suggesting that the professor sitting in Washington, D.C. is engaging in anything, suspicious, but it's just scary to say. That's one lesson from history.
All right, let me come back to you, Professor. I will go to our Japanese panelists a little bit later, but let me come back to you because it's important to ask that the logic you have just described, which is about the Second World War, at least from your academic perspective, is sending a message to the third country. And can we also use that logic, if that is the logic today, that the U.S. President Barack Obama's visit to Japan and seem to mend the fences with Japan is trying to send any message, at least on the sideline, to any other third country or fourth country? And is that still a smart policy to be used and a smart strategy to be used? As you said, it's already tested during World War II. It's not the best one. In fact, it was quite a bad one. Professor Kusnik.
Who is that question to?
Yes.
Oh.
Sorry.
Yes, it's a dangerous and regrettable policy, but we mentioned before that the United States has used nuclear weapons twice. Well, that's true, but the United States has actually used nuclear weapons repeatedly in the same sense that a robber holding a gun to someone's head uses that gun without pulling the trigger.
Well, Professor,
it's been an essential element of American diplomatic history throughout that period.
What I'm saying is not necessarily just the nuclear weapon itself, but rather the logic behind the policy making of using the very first nuclear bomb to Hiroshima, and whether that logic aiming at a third party when making the policies is still in the minds of Washington. But you probably have time to think about that question. Let me go to our Japanese panelists just to be fair. Professor Jimbo, this is a fair question, I guess, coming from Mr. Jia, also here in Beijing, that will those so-called right-wing forces inside Japan interpret it differently from what you just said, from an academic, that they would think about this as a support coming from the U.S. for Japan in the region and a mend of fences between the two countries, which would embolden Japan to go on whatever political path it aspires to be?
Well, I guess that it is always a good sign that we commit to the stronger U.S.-Japan alliance that has to be based on the U.S. commitment to defend Japan. And then, comes to the Obama's, compassionate stance towards supporting the Japanese main idea of the non-nuclear world. That is a good signal for the Japanese-U.S. alliance as a basis of the, trust between two sides. But I'd like to raise another argument. Japan has its another identity, which is the recipient of the U.S. nuclear umbrella or the extended deterrence. So in that case, what we really demand from the strategic perspective is that Obama also, issued the statement that as long as the nuclear weapons remain as a threat to Japan, for example, from North Korea, U.S. will provide effective and credible nuclear umbrella towards Japan.
Very interesting. A lot of twists and turns over there. Professor Jia, your response here to the 2 points.
No, I would think, a nuclear-free world has been said for decades and decades and decades. In action, countries march in the opposite direction. That's a reality, but then the decision-making behind the actual use of it is more critical. As to the point of a U.S.-Japan alliance, it's a fact of life. It has a long history to itself. It's just we hope and we need to stand guard against this alliance being used for an imaginary threat, and also which may lead to leaving damage on humanity wherever it is going to be.
Very interesting points raised by all of you gentlemen, but let me take you to some of the statistics indicating to us one of the important possibilities you have been talking about, that is the use of the weapons of mass destruction. After World War II, the amount of power of mass destruction weapons have only been increasing. Take a look at this. The Federation of American Scientists estimates there are now more than 17,000 nuclear warheads, and nearly a quarter of those are classed as operational. The little boy used in the Hiroshima, the so-called little boy, was only 15 kilotons, but many other atomic bombs being delivered by U.S. and Russia, then the USSR, are much more destructive than that. So here we come back to the eventual question, Mr. Kaznik, can we use nuclear weapons as a legitimate way to defend ourselves, even though it could have the possibility of destructing others?
No, that's why the positive message that Obama brings is that we need to abolish nuclear weapons. And Obama's been committed to that since his student days in the early 1980s. However, his actions are going the opposite direction. He's calling for $1 trillion modernization program of America's nuclear arsenal over the next 3 decades. So that's the wrong message to send, I believe.
Okay.
But we have cut back. You mentioned the 17,000 figure. It's actually a little bit under 16,000 now.
Okay.
But that's so enormous because even a limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan has been estimated, in which 100 nuclear weapons would be used. Even that limited nuclear war could lead to the deaths of 2 billion people and a partial nuclear winter.
I got your point. Professor Kaznik. I need to leave 10 seconds for the other two panelists to also respond to this question. Professor Jimbo from Japan, use nuclear weapons to defend oneself against the possible use of others of nuclear weapons? Is that logical?
Well, obviously that, President Obama tried to de-emphasize the role of the nuclear weapon in the U.S. security strategy. But at the same time, as long as the nuclear weapon remains as a basic kind of a threat to other country, I think we really need to maintain the effectiveness of the nuclear strategy.
Okay. Professor Jia here in Beijing, 10 seconds for you. Sorry for a very short answer.
Let's work towards improving nuclear safety and also disaster management in civilian use. I think that's more of a real fruit of humanity. Nuclear weapons has been a way of life and will be a way of life.
Thank you so much, Professor Jia Laojun here in Beijing, Ken Jimbo in Japan, and Peter Kaznik in Washington, D.C., U.S. for us. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Peace with us, of course. That should be the conclusion. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of a program, visit our website. Just type in World Inside CCTV News into your search engine. You'll be able to find us. Or you can also go to our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone at World Inside, thank you for watching. And tune in tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.